No matter what time a person lives in history, we all encounter certain social expectations that are placed upon us. Some expectations come from our families or from our ethnic backgrounds. Others come from our community of faith if we belong to one. Some others still come from being part of just living in a particular culture, like the United States or North United States compared to Southern United States. Social customs are simply understood to be the way things are, even when not a lot of explanation is given for why. For example, I remember a story about flip-flops when it happened years ago. It caught my attention then, I haven't forgotten. Now, you remember, like many of the things that we've been looking at in 1 Corinthians, flip-flops are non-essential. So normally this subject would not have made it to national news. And yet in this case, people took exception to them as a form of dress because of where they were being worn. In the summer of 2005, the Northwestern University women's lacrosse team came to visit President Bush at the White House. Here's a photo of what became a national conversation. The issue was widely debated, with arguments saying that it was just a silly complaint, while others were saying that the girls needed to show more respect. In reality, a couple of things were in play that were part of a legitimate conversation. One was the social expectation that when you are invited to visit a person of honor or rank, you dress appropriately. Another item was President Bush himself. In his White House, he had a dress code for his staff. As professional employees, he required the men to wear neckties and the women to dress appropriately, and no jeans for either gender. Plus, he was the president, not someone most of us get to meet in our lifetimes. Whatever your opinion is of that particular debate, this is a good illustration of something that has not changed really that much throughout history. What you wear communicates something about your identity and your beliefs. While some of the girls' parents were mortified by their daughter's first meeting with the later leader of our nation, at least it didn't have any lasting detrimental effects. There was no inherent spiritual danger or fallout. And yet, perhaps that incident will help serve to highlight another issue of dress that was, in fact, damaging corporate worship in Corinth. Let's read the entire passage together, and then we'll go back and look at it more carefully. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. Now, I praise you because you always remember me and keep the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of every woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is the one and the same as having her head shaved. So if a woman's head is not covered, her hair should be cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, she should be covered. A man, in fact, should not cover his head because he is in God's image and glory, but woman is man's glory. For man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. A man was not created for woman, but woman for man. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. But if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. Now, if you didn't know this already, this is one of the most intensely complex passages of the New Testament and widely debated. Not only does our modern culture despise recognizing any differences between men and women, but Paul uses words and sentences, or at least the structure of the sentences, that are able to be understood from several different perspectives. And perhaps an even greater obstacle is that we do not have a clear picture of the first century when it comes to this particular custom for covering or not covering your heads as part of your assembly. And that's why you're going to find a variety of opinions on the various points that Paul makes here. From our current place in history, it appears to be a very minor issue. And yet for Paul to take the time to address this indicates that it was damaging to the testimony of the believers and their relationships with one another. So for us to understand it historically and how it might impact our lives today, keep in mind some background issues as we examine what we're looking at. One of those background components is one that we must not forget as long as we're in 1 Corinthians. It is that core Corinthian attitude that prompted Paul to correct them about so many practices throughout this epistle. I have arrived. It's very me-centered. And it leads to a place where you're thinking of what is advantageous or beneficial to yourself rather than using your Christian freedoms for the benefit of the church. In fact, the focal points of chapters 11 all the way through 14, so we've got a ways to go with this, is on how we ought to conduct ourselves when we gather for worship as the family of God. Now, for us, and for most of Christianity throughout the world, that means our Sunday morning setting. To be the church and not something else, believers need to hold on to the fact that we carry a specific identity in Christ. We also have certain responsibilities to one another. And there are some practices that need to be maintained if we are to honor the Lord in being his church. So Paul begins with something rare in this particular letter, a word of encouragement. Now I praise you because you always remember me and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. You need to remember that for all the issues that needed to be corrected, Paul really loved this church. He wanted them to mature spiritually, and he wanted to see them numerically increase as more people came to faith. And for all the scolding that they received between Paul's 2 letters to Corinth, many believers did appreciate Paul and the work that he invested in them. And they remembered him regularly in their prayers, as they indicate right here, just as he did for them. They also kept the traditions that Paul handed down to them. Now, these were not his own practices, since they were given to him from the believers that first were born in the church in Jerusalem decades before. And by the time this was being written, only a few New Testament books would have been completed. So the traditions were not always recorded in written form, but transmitted from disciple to disciple, and would include Jesus' teachings and commands, which eventually made it into the 4 Gospels, the components of what happens when you gather together for worship, and the gospel message itself. And so Paul commends them. They did keep the traditions that he gave to them to function as a Christian community. However, we already know that they were not employing those traditions properly. And the first practice he's going to deal with at this point in the letter had to do with women praying and prophesying. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. Now, this one repeated word becomes a key point in understanding this passage. Paul uses it 9 times in just these 13 verses. And it actually means the bony part above your neck that holds your brains in place. Now, in the 21st century, when we hear that word, we also think of leader or authority. But that was not the only way to use it in the first century. So other possibilities include source or origin and preeminence. Each one of these options has its strengths and weaknesses, as that same word is used multiple times. But what is clear is that Paul moves back and forth between speaking of the head as your actual skull and then speaking of the head in a non-literal use, referring to a certain relationship between the one who is the head and some other person. And this verse offers us a very important insight from this moment forward in how this word is used. Verse 3 is rooted in the creation account and reflects the divine order. Whether we argue with it or not, there is an order where one has preeminence. And as you think about it, that is true in any market, in any career or home that you may walk into. This is not an issue of equality, as we'll certainly see later in the passage. This reminder is also important as a starting point as we look into the issue that Paul needed to correct here. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is the one and the same as having her head shaved. So at this point, we're given a second important term that threads throughout the passage: shame or dishonor. And this will stand in comparison to a third one that's still ahead for us. As I mentioned when we began, we don't have all the information we'd like to fully appreciate the head covering practice, which is the focal point of the passage. And yet, in that time and place, look at the results of not following that practice. In the first case, the man who covers his head dishonors his, and the woman who uncovers her head dishonors hers. The first use of the word in both cases for the man and woman is clearly a reference to physiology, the actual skull, while the second use takes us back again to verse 3. By going against a recognized order, the man or the woman dishonors Christ. They also bring dishonor on themselves in doing so. While some look at this particular verse and understand the covering to be actual hair, I don't agree with that perspective because it doesn't stand up as well when we get to actual hair a little later in the passage. So I am in line with those scholars that recognize the covering as an actual hood or veil of some kind. Verse 6. So if a woman's head is not covered, her hair should be cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, she should be covered. Now, in making the comparison here, Paul's using an extreme image for emphasis. If a woman considers it shameful to have her head shaved off, which, by the way, it was in that society, then she needs to understand that it's just as shameful to have her head uncovered in worship. There's a parallel there. His argument is this: if it is disgraceful for a woman to have short hair or be bald, then the only way to avoid either one is to keep your head covered. It's a very straightforward position, which is his point. Just leave things as they are. This was not the time or place to pick your own path. And the woman's action to disregard that custom was understood to do several things. First of all, this wasn't carelessness we're talking about. It was deliberate as an act of rebellion. It brought shame on her head, and it blurred the distinction between the sexes. Now, we'll come back to that last one again. Verse 7. A man, in fact, should not cover his head because he is God's image and glory, but woman is man's glory. For man did not come from woman, but woman came from man, and man was not created for woman, but woman for man. Here we're taken back to Genesis once again, as we pick up the third word, the opposite of shame and dishonor, which is glory. Now, when it comes to describing God, glory includes all of these things and more. When we give glory to God, we are celebrating his splendor, his greatness, and his awesomeness, either publicly or privately. And yet in our horizontal relationships, those attributes don't cross over in a one-on-one comparison. Yet having said that, since both men and women are created in the image of God, we do understand glory relationally. The existence of one brings honor and praise to the other. From verses 4 and 5, the reason for the man to keep the proper practice was to avoid bringing shame. Now, the same argument for or against head covering is not shame, but glory. So think about what Paul is describing. In Genesis, the stewardship of creation was initially given to Adam. And as Adam exercised that responsibility, first of all, by naming all the animals that were created, it became obvious that he had no partner. He was alone. And so God created Eve, taken from Adam's side, as a divinely made ally to help Adam fulfill God's will. They were working as a team. And in working as a team, the wife becomes the glory of man as man becomes the glory of God. Do you recall what happened right after Eve was presented to Adam? He gloried in her as he declared his gratitude to God in a poetic praise. This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So in addition to the appeal to the divine order for the practice of covering the head in public worship, we also have the creation order. Again, we all have someone that above us that we ought to give glory to rather than shame by what we do. Going back to the Trinity, we find a correlation. The three persons of the Godhead are all equal, and yet they work in order of priority, beginning with the Father. And as the Spirit draws attention to the Son, and the Son draws attention to the Father, all glory in one another. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Now, this is one of the verses that's probably even more challenging because of these other two words, authority and angels. The first one has been a favorite word of the Corinthian saints. We've seen it earlier in chapter 7. However, because of the different ways that Paul uses this word, different applications have been made throughout history of the church. The most common view is that the actual head covering is the sign that the woman is under authority. And that authority would include any man-woman relationship where the woman was a dependent, particularly the husband-wife relationship or the father-daughter. And yet, if the emphasis is on self-control as an aspect of authority, specifically in the exercise of our Christian liberties, then by willingly covering her own head, the woman is showing that she exercises control over herself. It's a sign of being responsible as she prays or prophesies publicly in the assembly, just like any man might do in the assembly. But it has to be done in a certain way to maintain proper order. So perhaps both authority and self-control are in view at the same time here. Now, the reference to the angels is just as challenging in determining why Paul mentions them. And if you read 6 commentaries, you'll have 7 opinions. But I'll offer a few possibilities. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Now, by definition, angels are messengers. They're there to communicate and carry out the will of God when God gives them an assignment. And yet, they are also part of the creation order under God. More than any other creature, they are the ones involved in worship in the heavens. They get it way more than we do. And so as we engage in worship from Sunday to Sunday on earth, Paul may be reminding us that they're watching. So for us to be mindful of them in return is to remember that the way we carry ourselves when we are gathering together as a body can either encourage or offend the angels, who anticipate a certain tone of decorum from people coming to worship the Lord. Another possibility is something we've seen before in Corinthians. The believers often were holding on to what we call an over-realized eschatology, which implies that all the blessings of the age to come, the second coming, are here now. It is the belief that all the blessings of the Messianic kingdom have already arrived. The health and wealth gospel that you hear so much in these mega churches where the pastor's making gazillions of dollars, that's the theology. I'm the child of the king. God, give it to me now because you owe it to me. And in this case, the women were disregarding accepted custom with the idea that they were already like the angels. So they had no need to follow the cultural expectations of the earth. But here's one aspect to all of this that is remarkably relevant to what has happened in our own society over the last decade or so. The uncovered head for the woman was about independence and self-identity. The unveiled woman wasn't being careless, as I said. She was rejecting her God-given place in creation as a female. This might be another reason that the angels were offended. Set the scene. Believers are gathered for worship, recognizing God as the highest authority over every single one of us. Men, women, angels, doesn't matter. God has preeminence over every one of his creatures. And yet, by uncovering their heads, some of the women were communicating that they do not accept that. Now, for a self-focused culture like our own, I fully realize that authority is an unsettling, probably a curse word. And yet there's no good way to use this passage as an excuse for a husband to lord over his wife or to treat her as less than a person made in God's image. Take a look at the next section, verse 11. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. Now, throughout this passage, Paul's been using the generic terms man and woman, and yet in the context, it's often understood to refer to husbands and wives. Verse 12 takes us clearly back to Genesis one more time, where the woman was formed from Adam's rib. And yet Paul immediately reminds us that while that is true, after that initial creation of Adam and Eve, every single man has come from a woman by birth. So the entire description is to show the interdependence of man and woman. There is a creation order that makes us distinct, not the same. And we were made for one another in order both to serve God. This kind of partnership is only found in a Christian worldview. God has arranged things so that one cannot exist without the other. And that's true in marriage, and it's true in the family of God. Now, that Paul has presented a couple of key reasons to keep the customs as they were, he asks the saints to make a choice, just as he did in the last chapter, as he says almost identically, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? He's expecting you to say no. And he offers one more reason as an illustration. Verse 14. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering? He's basically appealing us to just take a look around you. What do you see that is common and yet distinguishes men from women? Clothing and hair. What you wear communicates something about your identity and your beliefs. Paul's doing the same. He's taking a very visible and well-recognized difference between the two sexes, hair in this case, and using it as an analogy taken from everyday life. The way things are, the nature of things, as Paul says it, is reinforcing Paul's reasoning. He's saying basically a woman's hair is already longer, and it is a natural head covering. See, God designed it that way with the cover, which points to needing a head covering to show honor and respect when you're praying or prophesying. Now, we're not done with this issue, but let's finish this section first. If anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. So Paul offers a fifth reason. In the local assembly, men and women had certain responsibilities with regard to covering their heads or not covering their heads in worship. The other churches followed the same practice for the same reasons offered by Paul in this letter, and here they are. So the apostle is bringing them back to accurately assess themselves in light of the larger body of Christ. Local churches can very easily think that they're the only one that exists on the planet. But he's basically communicating, you're not unique. There is no benefit in trying to promote your spiritual freedoms and achievements. The other churches are not behaving that way, and for good reason. Paul's saying what you're doing is out of step with others who are living out the faith. So since we looked at this passage at this point, let's take a few minutes and identify the aspects that are cultural, along with those that are timeless. First of all, the context is corporate worship. It's not out shopping. It's not in the home. It's not at a social event. The fact that Christ is so central to this teaching is another piece of evidence that this is specifically for those who belong to him, not for those outside the church. Therefore, to force an application of this text into the workplace or the political sphere is just inappropriate. This passage does not teach that women cannot have positions of prominence in education, medicine, business, or civic life. And it does not teach that women are not allowed to pray or carry great responsibility in the life of the church. In fact, the passage supports two specific aspects of worship that are enjoyed by men and women alike, praying and prophesying. At the same time, we are not the world. We are the church. And every believer has someone who is above them. So there was a first century practice that demonstrated and visually showed us a maintained order. It showed respect to others in the congregation and it honored Christ all in one shot. When a woman is praying or prophesying in the assembly, it required a sign of authority in the context of that particular assembly. And a significant part of that expectation was, in fact, cultural. So it goes back, actually, if you think about it, to Paul's earlier statement about being all things to all people in order to win as many to Christ and not creating an unnecessary offense in those non-moral areas if you don't have to. So in that time, it was understood that wearing of hoods marked a married woman as respectable and worthy of respect. Why would you want to mess with that? Again, we don't have the advantage of understanding why this apparently very simple practice was so important. We just don't have enough information. And so it will continue to be debated, and some churches will insist that women have their heads covered at all times. And in certain faiths, they have to have their head covered all times 24/7, no matter where they are. What we do know is that this one issue could either build up or tear down the believers and their witness to others. Because this is such an interesting passage, I spoke to a couple of colleagues of mine about this, and we all agree. We don't have such a physical expression that would easily communicate that same authority structure today. Therefore, we do not practice head coverings for women for a couple of reasons. One is just what I said. There's no modern equivalent to show respect or authority. If somebody saw it, say, oh, I know exactly what's going on here, we'd have to explain it. And the other part is there's only two applications. If you're praying publicly or prophesying publicly. As a church now, if you look at our doctrinal statement, we do not believe that prophecy, as it was conducted during the days of Jesus, is still normative. Since the Bible was completed in the days of the apostles, we have been given the fully revealed will of God in the scriptures. Therefore, prophetic declarations are no longer needed. We don't need new revelation. So unless a woman was to pray publicly during the service, a direct application in American churches is not really possible. And yet what does carry into the modern society is that within various regions and people groups around the world, you know this if you talk to missionaries, hairstyles and clothing really does reflect their cultural understanding of masculine and feminine. And so in that case, those cultural practices would continue to reinforce the difference that God made between men and women. And the churches in those societies would have to apply this very differently. Now, since I've clarified where we are as a congregation concerning head coverings, a lot of what was raised in these verses has a lot to say in our current context. And let me start with the independent spirit that characterized the Corinthian church. You remember over the past year that we've been studying, I've mentioned at least a couple times now the Isthmian Games. They took place every 2 years to alternate with the ancient Olympic Games. And they were celebrated at the time that Paul was in Corinth. What's interesting is that by the time of the first century, women became competitors along with men. That was a newer development. And just a few years before Paul arrived in Corinth, Hydia became the female winner of the war chariot race in Corinth. So Ladies like her became celebrities and well-known, just like they do now for accomplishments. They were icons and images of those who women would look to admire. So contrary to the nonsense that we often hear about oppression at every turn in the past, Corinth was a place of liberated females. And that context is very helpful when you look at some of the dynamics among the women in the church. Now, I have to admit my own bias in this. As I've been reading through this letter over the past 12 months, my mental picture about all the problems that we've been studying has automatically taken me to the men in the church. Fair or unfair, I imagine that the guys are the ones promoting themselves and flaunting their freedoms, not being concerned about how others in the congregation might be affected. That assessment is certainly accurate. However, as we see here in chapter 11, the women were just as capable of self-centeredness and rebellion against God's order. There was a larger cultural attitude already in place in Corinth. Corinth had a feminist movement going on as well, very much like what our nation witnessed during the progressive movement of the early 1900s. Which brings us back to the discussion of hair and how our clothing and hair communicates something about your identity and your beliefs. The length of your hair for both men and women said something in Corinth about your attitude toward the conventions of your society. Were you a typical citizen, following the expected norms, not looking to draw attention to yourself by your attire or by your hairstyle? Or were you determined to forge your own path and have everybody look your way? In taking off their head coverings or cutting their hair short, the women were shedding that social norm. The men, letting their hair grow long, was also pushing back against the culture. And yet it was more than that. It was about identity and sexuality. So let's start with the men. I found this fascinating. The long hair on men at the time was not considered honorable. In the first century AD, long-haired identified the male homosexual. Now, in the museum in Corinth today, there are a couple of statues, they're called reliefs, that stand as a Roman commentary on the Greeks that they had conquered. If you remember, the Romans had taken over Greece a couple hundred years before Paul arrived. And from the Roman perspective, what made the Greek men lose was their long, curly hair. It implied that they were soft and effeminate. And this actual artwork was a way for the Romans to mock them ever since. That's a long mocking track record of 2,000 years. On the other side, when the woman cut her hair short, contrary to social custom, they were communicating something similar. Very short hair was a sign of a lesbian or a prostitute, potentially. So there's lots of implications for something so simple as hair. Now, we realize that hair length is not a universal identification of your gender or your position in society. And yet, having said that, even in America, this hasn't disappeared. And increasingly, the choice of a woman to look mannish or for a man to look feminine is a deliberate statement against what God has made. It is a conscious attempt to erase the differences between male and female. And so the hair and head covering practices actually intersected with a person's identity. There were religious and or sexual implications to it all, blurring the male-female relationships in general and sexual distinctions in particular. So the point at issue in this passage is not the position of women in the church, which the church seems to focus on historically. It's the differentiation between the sexes. Again, it's remarkable to me how relevant this is for our time period. That's still the mindset of modern feminism. Now, the two other terms that we read apply even more directly. Honor, pride versus dishonor and shame. The ongoing attitude underneath so much of the Corinthian troubles was this issue of pride, and we struggle with the exact same pitfall. And yet in our Western culture, that honor or dishonor is very, very personal. In my opinion, it's the natural outflow of our American worldview. It's all about my independent choices and actions. And so if I mess up royally and I'm found out to have committed some crime or sin, I will experience the guilt for me. That is, if even feel shame at all, because we're told that's not good either. But even so, in my moment of dishonor, I don't naturally think of my parents or my spouse or my kids or my neighborhood being affected. Eastern cultures, however, work with honor and dishonor very differently. In those cultures, my actions bring consequences to my parents, to my spouse, to my kids, to my neighborhood, to my family name. My family name may, in fact, be dishonored for generations because of something I've done wrong. In Corinth, that same shame would naturally be shared by the Church of Jesus Christ. Again, for several chapters now, and even more so, as we'll see in chapter 12 and going forward, Paul is driving home the reality that it's not about me, it's about us. God is reminding us that while dress, clothing, head coverings, hair length are not inherently ethical issues, they do have implications for our witness to the world and implications for our relationships within the church. One contemporary application to this is very simply for us to be deliberate in what we wear when we come to gather on Sunday, particularly when you participate publicly and visibly as part of the service. How we present ourselves should not draw unnecessary attention, but it should help us limit the distractions in order for our focus to remain on Christ. So Paul, in this passage, has helped us to see that the theologies of salvation and creation actually get intertwined with sociology. A healthy society reflects what God put in place in the Garden of Eden. And one key reason that our own culture is so perverse and so mangled is because people have rejected and purposely undermined the creation order and the divine order. When Adam was created, Eve was formed from his body as a complementary helper. Like I said, it was a team where he had no interest in dominance and she had no interest in manipulation. They shared the goal of being made in God, by God, for distinct and beneficial roles in creation. Sin changed all of that. Now, men get self-righteous by trying to dominate women and look at them as objects for their own purposes. Now women get self-righteous, trying to control men and belittle them for their own objectives. But a healthy relationship is where one desires to serve the other in order to make the other one successful, particularly in marriage. The relations between the genders is neither one of domination and subservience, nor one of sameness and interchangeability. And you know that the family of God is the one place on this planet where that reality is supposed to be on display. The Lord designed his church to be the one place where the truths of God become evident and we get a glimpse into what eternity is going to be like. So if you need to hold on to one word from this passage, it might be the word glory. When we know and embrace our uniqueness as man or woman, created by God, and live according to those complementary differences, God is glorified. All of this has been accomplished because of the cross. The gospel is the only power that can undo the damage of the world and Satan. The gospel is the only pathway to clarify our own identity and bring us each back to proper relationship with the Creator and with one another as it was designed to be. How we conduct ourselves when we gather together is demonstrated through respect to God, to each other, to the society we're trying to reach with the gospel, and to ourselves. Let's pray. You're an amazing God, and you give us interesting passages to wrestle through. Thank you for the time that we've had to work this through for a few moments. And the questions that come up, give us the ability to interact with one another and gain some more clarity. Help us, Father, to be able to discern your word increasingly as our years go by, so that we can learn to better and better apply the text appropriately to our society and to our homes. And we thank you that you've given us a place to do that, that you've protected this nation, that you've protected our church from assault. And we ask now to protect those other churches that are on target lists for people who want to invade and disrupt the orderly worship that you have put together. Give them grace and wisdom as they encounter some of those things. And Father, we ask that you to enable us this week to do our best to reflect who you are in what we say and do for the sake of Jesus. Amen.